Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I don't have to say what we are speaking about. I don't have to say who's the speaker. You're aware, and that's what we are. Anyway, welcome, Ambassador Dilip Sinha, on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies. I'm delighted that you have agreed to speak on this subject, of which you have a very great amount of experience, both in Delhi and Geneva. And of course, this is a subject of considerable interest to all students of international affairs. So, without further ado, may I request you to make your presentation.
Thank you, sir. And friends, thank you for it's working. Thank you for coming to listen to my it's not. Yeah, it's on now. To listen to my talk. This is actually a work in progress for me because I am working on the Security Council, especially its enforcement actions. And as part of this, naturally, China comes in as well. So when Mr. Ashok requested me to speak on this, I thought I would come and speak, although my work is really incomplete, but I'd like to throw up several ideas and like to also benefit from your suggestions so that I can clear my own thinking on the subject. China, as you all know, has had the most colorful, the most checkered membership of the Security Council among all the P5. From day one, the other China, that is Taiwan, was a member, Republic of China was a member, and then midway they swapped horses. But let's begin from the very beginning. How did China become a member of the Permanent Five? China was an unlikely candidate for this. In the war, China wasn't exactly a fully sovereign country. UK and the US still had extraterritorial rights on China, which they gave up in the course of the war. But China was a part of the famous declaration when the United Nations was formed as a wartime alliance on the 1st of January 1942, so soon after Pearl Harbor and the US joined the war. And two of the leaders assembled there, Churchill and Roosevelt in Washington. And there were two ambassadors, the ambassador of the Soviet Union and the ambassador of China, T.V. Soong, who was the brother-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek. So these four were the leaders who made the announcement. The next day, 22 other countries joined this alliance. India was part of that. And that is how China became part of this core group of the allies. But China was not part of all the consultations process that took place in the course of the war, when the outline of the new international order was worked out between three major people, which is Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. In fact, China was ignored most of the way, even though France at times was a part of the consultations process. De Gaulle was included, for example, in the Second Quebec Conference. But in the major conferences that took place, which were Cairo, November 1943, Tehran, again 1943, November, December, Yalta, 1945, February, and Potsdam, July, August 1945. In these, only the major powers met and decided how the new world would be, and China was ignored there. So, why was China included in this? Clearly, it was because of Roosevelt, because in the Asia Pacific, China was one country that he could count as a force of some kind against Japan. Remember, Russia did not join the war against Japan until very late, almost middle of 1945. So China was the only country that was active in this region, although it was ruled by KMT, the Kuomintang. You'll have pardon my Chinese pronunciation, our Chinese experts here, so you'll have pardon my Chinese pronunciation. The Kuomintang was there, but the Kuomintang was busier fighting the Communist Party, which was also a force, than fighting the Japanese who were occupying Manchuria at that time. But nonetheless, they were able to keep a certain amount of Japanese force occupied in China. Churchill thought that China did not deserve a place in the P5, and he told Roosevelt as much. He said he treated China as a puppet of the US. Roosevelt, I suspect, also had a certain soft corner for China. Roosevelt's grandfather, his mother's father, his Nana, made his fortune in Hong Kong trading with China, and in those trade basically meant smuggling opium to China. He made his fortune twice, and Roosevelt inherited a lot of his fortune through his mother from his grandfather. And Roosevelt spent his childhood also in Hong Kong. So I suppose he had a certain amount of soft corner for that, but I'd again be happy to listen to other ideas that you may have on why China was included in the Permanent Five. We start off with the Permanent Five meeting. China, even in the main negotiations of the Charter took place in Dumbarton Oaks, end of 1944. There again, China participated, but only for part of the conference. Part of the conference was the Soviet Union that was participating, and part of the conference it was China. And the Charter was finalized. They went down to San Francisco, formed it up there, and started meetings. Now we come to the main role of China in the Security Council itself. And here I have broadly classified the phases of the Security Council into four, depending upon the balance of power in the Security Council, and as reflected not only in the way various countries use the veto and which countries required to exercise the veto, and also in the nature of activity or inactivity of the Security Council in the course of these phases. And the four phases that I have been able to discern are from January 1946, when the Security Council first met in London, till January 1970. The second phase starts from March 1970, and this phase is important because this was the first time in March that the US exercised its veto, which means the US had lost its control over the Security Council. So a second phase starts because till March 1970, the only country to exercise the veto was the Soviet Union, except for two vetoes each by Britain and France in 1956 in the Suez Canal crisis. Apart from those two vetoes each, the only country to exercise the veto in this phase was the Soviet Union. Then suddenly in March 1970, things change. Resolutions start coming on South Rhodesia, then on South Africa, and Britain and US find themselves in a minority, and they have to exercise the veto to protect their allies in Southern Africa. So this phase from March 1970 comes to December 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, and a new phase starts, which is January 1992, and this comes up to the 17th of March 2011. That's a very specific date, because that's the day on which the last resolution was adopted by the Security Council authorizing enforcement action on Libya. Thereafter, things changed in the Security Council. So you have this very active phase of the Security Council from 1992 to 2011, and then to the modern times. Now it so happens that if you look at China's participation and role in the Security Council, then it kind of dovetails very smoothly with these four phases. In the first phase, China wasn't present there. The People's Party wasn't there. The Republic of China represented China. And in this phase, the Republic of China was essentially a stooge of the Americans. They didn't vote any differently. They didn't participate much in debates. And the People's Republic was outside, abusing the United Nations as and when the opportunity came about. And the first occasion, major event that took place was soon after the Communist Party came to power in China, which was end of 1949. And as you know, in June 1950, the Korean War started. And then when the deadlock came in, then discussions started, and India and Britain wanted the People's Republic, the PRC, to be called in as an invitee to participate in the discussions. So after much debate and against stiff opposition from the US, a PRC representative was called, a gentleman called Wu Xiuchuan. Okay, his pronunciation is the general, was invited to speak in the debate. A huge debate took place as to who would speak first, the US or China. Eventually, after some time, I think it was China that was allowed to speak first because they were invitees. So General Wu, of course, took the opportunity to start on a tirade against both the UN and the Kuomintang regime. He called it the Kuomintang Reactionary Remnant Clique. And then he said that the Communist Party had liberated all of China except Taiwan and Tibet. And he also declared, and I quote, "I'd like to remind members of the Security Council that so long as the United Nations persists in denying admittance to a permanent member of the Security Council representing 475 million people. It cannot make lawful decisions on any major issues or solve any major problem, particularly those which concern Asia. So this was his conclusive remark on the Security Council. Now, of course, India tried to bargain and see if PRC could be made a member, and India made a proposal saying that suppose you set up a committee comprising the US, Britain, PRC, the Soviet Union, India and Egypt to deal with questions of Taiwan and Korea and the whole Far Eastern question. But the US, of course, turned it down. And in fact, Secretary General Trygve Lie also thought it was they didn't agree with this proposal because he felt that to give membership to the PRC would be rewarding an aggressor. Early in 1951, the PRC was declared an aggressor nation by a resolution of the General Assembly. So PRC still has the distinction of having been declared an aggressor by the UN itself. That resolution, I don't think, has been reversed. Has not been. I don't think it's been reversed. So China continues to be regarded as an aggressor nation. So that was the Korean War story. If you know about the war, you don't need to go into that. Thereafter, as I said, China would continue to accuse the US of being misused by UN of being misused by the US for serving its imperialist goals. And in 1960, another Chinese leader, Jaemin Jipao, said, "Countless historical facts of the past 15 years have repeatedly proved that the United States imperialism has all along used the United Nations as an instrument of aggression. In the face of these cold, hard facts, how can anybody believe that the UN, which still remains under the US control, will stand for justice and will struggle against colonialism?" So this was during the Congo crisis, during which again there was participation of China in the civil war in the Congo. Now at this time, China would also feign to have no interest in the permanent seat in the Security Council. So when Khrushchev came to power, China didn't share his openness towards the UN, and on the restoration of the seat to China, again, I'm not going to locate, but I was told around the late 1950s, China actually wrote to the Soviet Union saying, "Don't pursue our seat for the Security Council, we are not interested in it." But I'm not going to locate that quote when I started doing this work. He said, one of the Chinese leader, Jaemin Jipao, said, "As for the restoration of Chinese seat in the United Nations, this is primarily an urgent need, not of China, but of the United Nations and the World Organization." So China continued to take this line that the Security Council cannot be a world organization without China. And of course, they kept criticizing the Taiwan clique being present in the Security Council. Then we come to the second phase, starting as I said in 1970, which coincides with China's entry into more or less coincides, China's entry into the UN. And this came about, as you know, because on 15 July 1971, Nixon announced that he would visit China the following year. At that time, Kissinger had already paid a secret visit, which was not known, but he had already paid a secret visit to China. So in October 1951, Albania introduced a resolution in the General Assembly saying that China, the PRC, was the only lawful representative of China and should be admitted to the UN and given China's permanent seat in the Security Council. Now this resolution was adopted 76, 35, 17. That is 76 for, 35 against, and 17 abstentions, plus another 3 countries that did not participate in the vote. This was October 1971, which means a month before the Bangladesh war, but India voted for China's entry. The countries that voted against were the US, Japan, and Brazil. India, Britain, France, the Soviet Union voted for the resolution. China, incidentally, made the observation that it wasn't interested in membership, but didn't want to disappoint 76 members who were keen on China's entry, and therefore it would accept membership, and it joined. it went to the Security Council also. There was no resolution in the Security Council either welcoming or saying anything to China. China just moved into its seat. And Article 23 was not amended. Article 23 gives the names of the 5 permanent members, and it continues to say Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China. And today, the article remains the same. So the PRC occupies the seat of the Republic of China. So now in this phase, China comes in as a new country to the Security Council. It essentially took a low profile. But that does not mean that it did not step out and protect the interests of countries that it thought were its friends. And this came about in the very first year of its entry to Security Council. Bangladesh applied for membership, and this was within 1 year of China joining the UN. And China, as you all know, vetoed the resolution. The resolution was to be adopted, 14 votes for, and only China was the negative vote. So China, despite the fact that it kept a low profile in this phase, did not participate very actively in debates. When it came to its crucial allies and key interests, it was prepared to step out and stand up for its friends. So it was the sole negative vote, and it stopped Bangladesh's entry into the Security Council, into the UN. Then came the 1973 war in the Middle East, and here again, it was, let me see what I got here. At this time, the US decided to broker talks between Israel and Syria outside the UN. And it was a very peculiar thing that happened. For the first time, all the 10 non-permanent members were very offended that the that the UN was being bypassed by the US, and talks between Israel and Syria were being taken outside the UN. And the Security Council adopted a resolution saying that the Security Council must have a role in the peace process. And all the 5 permanent members abstained, including China. Although China claimed that it was a developing country, it was with the developing countries, with the countries of Asia, Africa, and the Third World. It did not support the resolution. It stayed away. And the excuse that it took was, and the Chinese ambassador said, is that the Chinese delegation is always firmly opposed to any attempt of the 2 superpowers to make behind-the-scene deals at the expense of the interests of the Arab and Palestine people. And then it did not vote. So the effect was the same, but it did not choose to come with the 10 non-permanent members. But this does not mean that China at this time did not have ambitions of being considered to be a superpower or a big power. Although it feigned interest in being called a developing country. And a very interesting debate took place in 1976 when the Security Council was considering South Africa's aggression of Angola. A resolution was being adopted, and the Security Council was about to condemn the South African aggression against Angola. And in this, the Chinese ambassador, Huang Hua, condemned both the Soviet Union and the US as 2 hegemonic powers trying to create spheres of influence. So the Soviet ambassador criticized China for harboring superpower ambitions and not recognizing Angola, which was recognized at that time by 94 developing countries and, of course, by the communist countries. So when the Soviet ambassador accused China of harboring ambitions of being a superpower, what did Huang Hua, the Chinese ambassador, say? The Soviet representative has slandered China as a superpower. This is a preposterous fabrication. China is a developing socialist country belonging to the Third World. China does not have a single soldier or base abroad. It would be unfavorable to the people of China and to the rest of the world if China should become a superpower. This is 1976 on the Angola crisis. So this phase eventually came to an end. China did not exercise any further vetoes, but it did not stand up otherwise for anything in particular. Then comes the third phase. As you know, Soviet Union collapsed, Russia came in. Russia then had very narrow interests. It did exercise the veto in this phase also, but on extremely narrow band of issues where its very close core national interests were involved. Otherwise, the Russian Federation was quite happy to go along with the resolutions proposed by the Western countries, who by this time held sway over the Security Council. And they were able to not only get the Security Council to adopt authorization resolutions for authorizing member states to use their military force to enforce the resolutions of the Security Council in countries wherever they thought there was a need for intervention or there was a threat to international regional peace and security. And as you know, in this phase, lasting from 1992 to 2011, the Security Council authorized resolutions authorizing enforcement action in 10 countries. Iraq, Kuwait was one, Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, Haiti, Zaire, Albania, Central African Republic, Kosovo, and finally Libya. Now, some of these resolutions were adopted unanimously, because everybody went along, and some were adopted with China abstaining. China did not oppose any of these resolutions. It had the veto, so it could have blocked any of these resolutions. But China, in the absence of support from the from Russia, kept a low profile, and it would abstain in the vote, not step out and say that these resolutions should be vetoed. But it would still criticize these resolutions, and it would say things like a resolution that interfered in the internal affairs of countries. China would say it's interference and we won't accept it. When the Security Council would say there should be military intervention to deliver humanitarian assistance, then China would again criticize it, but again not veto the resolution. So you had the Soviet Union, Russia of course supported all these resolutions. Countries like India, which was there in the case of the Iraq resolution, India was there. It was there when the later part of the Iraq resolution came in as in 1992, not the main one. India abstained on that, but China had abstained on the main resolution, which was 770 in which the action was authorized. Somalia, China joined the resolution. It did not abstain as it had done in the case of Iraq. So again, China looked at its interests and balanced them depending upon where the balance of its interests lay. In the case of Bosnia, China supported all the resolutions except the first one, where Pakistan and Venezuela had abstained. In Haiti, China abstained along with Brazil. In Haiti, as you know, the US resolution was to replace a coup attempt and to restore the legitimately elected leader of Haiti. In Rwanda, China again abstained along with Brazil, New Zealand, Nigeria, and Pakistan. China supported the resolutions in the case of Zaire and Central African Republic, but in the case of Albania, a close ally, it abstained. It did not veto the resolution. And China also abstained in the case of Kosovo. In the case of Libya, of course, as you all know, there were 5 countries that abstained: India, Brazil, China, Germany, and Russia. So, in this period, China exercised its veto twice in this phase when it was when the Western countries were dominant. And the 2 resolutions that were vetoed by China both dealt with Taiwan. So in the case of Taiwan, China was quite clear that even if it stood alone, it would veto. And the first resolution was in 1997 in the case of Guatemala. And it was a very simple resolution. Guatemala had just held a peace agreement had taken place, and all the parties were celebrating. And in that celebration, Guatemala invited Taiwan. So China vetoed the resolution, saying we are not going to welcome the signing of the peace agreement in Guatemala because of, he says, Guatemala is offering a venue for secessionist activities against China, disregarding the solemn warnings of the Chinese government. Then in 1999, that was 2 years later, in Macedonia, that former Yugoslav republic, there again a very simple resolution was being passed for renewing the mandate of the UN peacekeepers. So it was for another 3-4 months, and the resolution would have been adopted unanimously. But Macedonia made the mistake at that time of inviting or recognizing Taiwan. And that was, of course, a big no-no with China. But this time China did not say that it was Taiwan that was the cause of it. China said that, it used an interesting excuse. It said that we don't want money to be wasted in peacekeeping operations in Europe when there are much more serious crises in Africa. So we should use the money, save the money and use it in peacekeeping operations in Africa, not in Europe. So China vetoed that resolution. So effectively there were 3 solo vetoes of China. Bangladesh, Guatemala and Macedonia. So one was for Pakistan and the 2 were for Taiwan. So this shows the kind of interest, the kind of relationship that, all-weather relationship that China has with Pakistan. Now we come to the 4th phase, which is 2011. After Libya, as you all know, China and the Soviet Union, China and Russia came together and they joined hands in vetoing resolutions, and they vetoed 6 straight resolutions on Syria. None of these called for military action. They only imposed sanctions and may have led later on to military action against Syria. But Russia and China didn't want to have anything to do with enforcement action, and they vetoed all the resolutions. So China hereafter started vetoing resolutions in tandem with Russia. 6 of them were on Syria, and 1 each were on Zimbabwe and Myanmar. These were sanctioned resolutions, so they were stronger resolutions, and there was definite policy on the part of both China and Russia. Again, it shows the kind of allies for which China was prepared to stick its neck out and veto resolutions. And that gives an idea of China's overall policy as well. Today, China has emerged as the 3rd largest contributor to the regular budget of the UN. It is the 2nd largest contributor to the peacekeeping forces. China is, in terms of soldiers that it contributes, is one of the top, I think it's the number 4 or 5. It has about 2,500 troops in peacekeeping, which is a unique thing because none of the other 4 contributes anything more than a few, I think 70, 80 or 100 is about the highest that any of the P4 gives. So China is quite unique in this respect that it still contributes troops to peacekeeping. But the countries it selects are countries where it has crucial economic or political interests. So it is South Sudan, DRC, Lebanon because of historical reasons, and a couple of other countries where it posts its troops, but again very selectively, keeping in mind its economic and political interests. So it has gone along with sanctions on countries like North Korea, as you know, on Sudan also, Iran as well. It went along with those sanctions, but there have been reports that China also clandestinely violates these sanctions. Certainly in the case of North Korea, there have been reports recently. In the case of South Sudan, a UN panel of experts in 2015 had said that China had continued to supply arms to South Sudan despite violence there in which civilians were being targeted. Other things about, of course, whether nuclear proliferation of Pakistan and Korea, of course, those are separate issues. But then I'll conclude my talk with just a couple of thoughts on as I'm throwing up this question, does China deserve to be a permanent member of the Security Council? In terms of contribution, financial contribution, yes, certainly. It is the 3rd largest and largest. But in terms of the new approach of the UN, promoting democracy, promoting human rights, where does China fit into this? China has never had any elections. Human rights, it doesn't doesn't accept the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which over 170 countries are parties to. China has the distinction of not having ratified this treaty along with Saudi Arabia and Myanmar. China does not bother to disclose how many people it executes in a year. It's the only country in the P5 that hasn't held elections. China's closest allies are countries that can best be called rogue states like Pakistan, North Korea, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, Albania, Sudan. These are its closest allies. China is not a party to the International Criminal Court, which of course several of the countries are not. But it also has not accepted the International Court of Justice's compulsory jurisdiction. When the Philippines wanted to take the South China dispute to arbitration, China refused to participate in it. They didn't accept arbitration. So with these thoughts, I'll conclude.
So thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's a tremendous sweep of from historical background to the politics of once the transition takes place from ROC to PRC. Incidentally, has PRC never objected to a seat which describes it as the seat of ROC? No. They've taken it.
I suppose that if they raise the issue, they'll pick it up because by any definition, they are the Republic of China. And the same thing happened with the Soviet Union. That also name has not been changed.
Oh,
and Russia just walked into the seat. Britain very cleverly called a summit meeting in January 1992, to which of course she also participated, few members. And they just welcomed Yeltsin and clapped. And that was it. Now, was Russia a successor state of the Soviet Union? If you go back to the CIS charter, it says that each of the republics of the CIS will take its own, enact its own responsibilities as an inheritor state of the USSR. So the Russian Federation is not the sole inheritor state of the USSR, but it moved into the seat, and so these two countries continue to occupy that, and normally continues.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the Q&A stage. I have some questions, but I will not begin with my own questions. So, any hands going up?
I just want to ask. I'm Vijay Nayak, I'm journalist. Could you say something on, because you have taken a historical perspective of China and United Nations and the Security Council, why is China constantly opposing the entry of India into UNSC?
Any other question at the moment? Okay. Yes.
About the peacekeeping, are you sure that China is the second largest troop contributors in peacekeeping operation right now? It may be the largest contributor among the P5, but do you really show the data of being the second largest contributor in the whole world? I'm really doubtful of this. And second thing is just not just a contribution of peacekeepers, but what kind of role the Chinese peacekeepers are usually assigned or usually sent. They are not sent till very recently for combat operation, just for the support system. So in a sense that if you compare with, say, Pakistan, India or Bangladesh, these countries are almost involved in all kinds of activities. But China till very recent years is only for supporting activities, not for the combat operation. I think that's my understanding of it. The another major thing is about the change of India's position on China's membership. I think from very beginning, India was supporting, despite of China being very aligned with Pakistan, it continued to support China's membership to Security Council till the end. And then there was a talk about, there was an offer of India to replace China as a permanent member, and India's position on that.
Okay, I'll. I forgot your snack. Yeah, you asked about entry of India.
Into UNSC.
Why is China opposing?
Over the years, it seems to be fine all the time.
Yes, I mean, why China opposes? I would defer to other people who know more about China and how China frames its policies. And also perhaps one of the things that I could not do, because since I'm not an expert on China, I could not correlate China's policy in the UN with internal changes in China. Obviously there must be changes internally in China which would be reflected in China's policy towards the UN and its performance in the Security Council. And that would be something I think that other people need to work on a little more. But I can think of one reason straight away. As I said, I cited the example of Bangladesh. Why China opposed the entry of Bangladesh? It was because of Pakistan. Because Pakistan was opposed at that time. So China said that Bangladesh could not enter the Security Council, the UN, because there were resolutions of the Security Council against India, and India continued to have Pakistani troops as POWs. So India was in violation of the Security Council. Therefore, as long as India had continued to follow this policy, Bangladesh would not be allowed entry into. So it was a question of the alliance with Pakistan. And since Pakistan is opposed to India's membership, that's one very strong reason for China to do so, but there may be other reasons also. Rivalry, perhaps, the fear that India may also become a rival power in Asia. So that is a possibility, but we can discuss this issue. The Chinese contribution to peacekeeping and peacekeepers. The number of peacekeepers, yes, China should be number 4, number 5 in the number of troops there. As it is about 2,500. The highest is Ethiopia, then you have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and I'm not sure, maybe Indonesia or some other countries might have a slightly higher number than China. So, but it's in the top 10, I'm sure. It's the largest contribution, and among the P5, it is the highest, by far the highest. What is the second highest for China is the contribution to the peacekeeping budget, which is, as you know, is about $6.8 billion, and China contributes 10% of it. The only country higher than China is 28%, as the US.
Which doesn't pay up.
China pays up?
USA doesn't pay up.
You see, because the peacekeeping contribution is linked to the contribution to the regular budget, but the P5, they have to pay a premium because they are permanent members, so they pay a slightly higher amount than their contribution to the regular budget. Whereas the other countries, especially countries like India, etc., they get a discount. So our contribution to the peacekeeping is much lower than our contribution to the security, to the regular budget of the UN. You mentioned about China's, India's support to the PRC. You're absolutely correct that India supported the PRC. In fact, I was going through the records and I found that India first became a member of the Security Council in January 1950. And in the very first intervention of the Indian ambassador, D.N. Rao, what is it called? Benigal N. Rao. What does N stand for? Narsingh Rao. So I don't know what the N for. Benigal Narsingh Rao. In his very first statement, after saying thank you, Mr. President, congratulations, etc., etc., he said, please make PRC a member of the Security Council. This was the very first statement that we made in the Security Council. And
Security Council or the General Assembly?
No, this was Security Council. I haven't gone to the General Assembly debates, but the Security Council debate, we became a member for the first time in January 1950, which was 2-3 months after PRC was formed.
Yeah.
And the very first point that we made in the Security Council was, please give the seat to the PRC. And if you look at our record of our statements in the General Assembly, in our debates, the main statement that you make, every country makes a statement in the General Assembly, in the general debate, in the month of September, October. And that is the most authoritative statement on foreign policy of any country on a global platform. And India, since 1950 till about the late 1950s, the one point that makes a consistent theme in that is China's PRC seat in the UN. It is only in the late 1950s, I think 58 or so, that India stopped making this point. Till then, apart from decolonization, non-alignment, etc., everything, this was one of the consistent themes in ours. So India's support to China PRC's membership has been consistent. And as I pointed out, even when the issue came up in the General Assembly in October 1971, it was just 1.5 months before the Bangladesh war, in which India feared that China might intervene. India still supported and voted for that resolution of Albania for PRC's membership. So India maintained that consistent policy towards the PRC despite differences and issues. I think that was it. Yeah, then you mentioned about the Chinese soldiers who go to peacekeeping, that they don't participate in combat operations. Well, actually, peacekeeping operations are not supposed to participate in combat operations. although in the third phase of the UN, you would recall that when these enforcement actions were being authorized, the Security Council also started adopting resolutions empowering the peacekeepers to take robust action wherever required. So they would use phrases like all necessary measures may be taken by the peacekeepers, which meant that they could use force. But the general understanding has always been that peacekeepers use force only in self-defense, not otherwise. And it's only been in some cases, in Congo they used robust peacekeeping was done and the UN lost a number of forces. And some places in Africa, again, they had been caught in crossfire, as a result of which they had to intervene. Otherwise, the UN peacekeepers do not participate in combat operations. That's one of the definitions of peacekeeping operations. So if China's forces have not been involved, that's a good thing. That means that the places that China selects have also been well carefully selected. And they don't get into places where there's possibility of hostile action.
Yes.
Thank you very much, sir. Very briefly, I must say, Dilip, first of all, congratulations. I think the coverage, the history of how PRC came to be into UN as the permanent member and the anecdotal beginnings about PRC, etc., is very interesting. I have one small question really. How did it happen that even though in the charter, PRC and Russian Federation have not been brought in through amendment, which is not at all difficult. How did it happen that ROC and Soviet Union continue, USSR continue to be mentioned there, but the places are taken by the other countries with completely different names, which is not, first of all, in the case of ROC and PRC, it is particularly striking because PRC has not even taken from ROC as a successor state. At least in the case of Russian Federation, I remember in 1991 when after the breakup of Soviet Union, there was a consideration, there was a statement in the Security Council where Russia Federation took over as a successor state to Soviet Union, the Security Council and the United Nations. So that was regularized. But in the case of PRC and ROC, that remains a bit of an enigma. I don't know whether you have done some research on this, but if you have any information, it will be very, very useful. Number two, just want to share something. Apart from the various other factors, because I have been there from 1991 to 95, and for the 2 years, we were members of the Security Council, so I've seen the China behavior from the Security Council itself. Apart from the ideological factors, like Pakistan or Taiwan, which weighed heavy on Chinese voting, but not always conclusively. I found that 91 was the period when China was looking for various kinds of economic concessions internationally, particularly from the USA, etc. And while I don't recall the details, now invariably their vote on Iraq or Somalia, etc., would be decided immediately after they got some trade concession or the other economic concession from the Western world. In some cases, like in the case of Iraq, it became abstention, which is a very unusual thing in Security Council, but they abstained on Iraq actually. They didn't. And in the case of Somalia, it became yes. So it was linked actually to the economic agenda rather than ideological, which they used in the statement, but it was not really that important. Second thing, if I could just clarify about the budget again, basically, you did mention it. Normally what happens in the case of the UN is that a member country loses voting rights in the UN, including in the Security Council, if they are in areas for 3 years. Therefore, the USA pays up for its regular contribution. And the areas count only not for the peacekeeping budget, but for the regular budget. So the US will pay up for the areas after 3 years to maintain the vote in the UN. But in the case of the peacekeeping budget, they are hugely late simply because that becomes a handle for them to keep some kind of a control over the field operations division, which is the logistics division. And it's for the first time, in fact, that Atul Khare has become the USG responsible for the field operation division. Otherwise, before him, it has been an US person, US citizen, who has always headed the field operations division. So that was the basically quid pro quo, and they still remain in areas. So China remains committed to the peacekeeping, to the paying of the budget, if not the number of personnel. I just thought I'd just answer.
Yes. What do you, just a moment, did you want to answer, you began with the question?
I began with a question, but if there is an
Yeah.
answer, you could
All
otherwise
right.
not.
Okay. Yes. 1, 2, right.
Yeah.
And 1, 2,
We'll take 2 at a
3.
time, otherwise I forget the questions.
And another one. 4.
I
I mean, it's very interesting from the time when I had no hands up, I have now a profusion. That's very good. Okay.
am Dr. Ashiko from IDSA. Your Excellency, which countries are opposing the reformation of the UN Charter? Second is, why India did not sign NPT? And what would be the position of India's membership, permanent membership in the Security Council? If so, which year is likely?
Which year?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I just will intervene here, though I mean, I'm flattered that Your Excellencies, I'd almost forgotten. Anyway, but though it's up to Dilip to answer all those questions, but generally we'll stick to the theme. China in the UN Security Council rather than India in NPT, which is going miles off from our theme today. Important subject, but miles away. So, but I'll leave it to him. I'll leave it to him if he wishes to answer that. Please.
I'm Avinash. I just finished a paper actually on China and the R2P debate. If you
China
look at
and
the responsibility to protect debate. If you look at Chinese position on UNSC, it's consistent with how it has looked at the issue on the R2P debate. For example, in 2005, there was this big conference called ICISS. I don't recall the full form. There was a UN conference called ICISS. China took a very specific position on that and brought out a position paper immediately afterwards on that issue. Its principal objective on that issue and on UNSC resolutions has been the failure of state, and that's on that position it voted in favor of the resolution in Libya and against in Syria. Also, its consideration was the evacuations that it had to do in Libya, 36,000 or something of that sort, which it did, and it was its biggest operation. On the issue of Chinese participation in UN peacekeeping operations, it started with doctors, then anti-mining equipment, then observers, then police, and in 2013 for the first time they had sent combat troops. But that also first in Mali and second in Sudan, I guess. So both places where they have got more than enough of investment. So these two issues are, I thought I'll highlight to you.
I'll take answer while you forget the question, sir.
Oh, okay.
May I take it? I'll do it after in second, otherwise I'll forget the questions. Sorry, Suresh Nathi, I'll take his question later. Let me go to the reverse one. I ask him your questions. ICISS, this is the Canadian committee, isn't it? International Committee on International Security and...
Yes.
This was in 1999, which was the origin of the whole philosophy of R2P. So what happened was that after Rwanda's genocide, Canada had set up this committee called the ICISS, International Committee for something, I forget that full form now, security, and they recommended a series of actions which included R2P, that the international community has a responsibility to protect civilians in case the government of a country does not do it or is actually repressing its people. And then in 2005, the World Summit that met, they adopted this concept, and this concept was then reinforced by a resolution of the Security Council in 2000. Soon after that, I think 2006, there was a Security Council resolution confirming what the heads of governments had adopted. Libya vote just said China, yes, but China could have vetoed. India, even if it had voted against it, it wouldn't have mattered. although we abstained. But China could have vetoed the resolution, but it did not. And whatever the reasons be for that, we can go into that. As I said, but then that was the last resolution that they allowed to go through. The question about who are the people who opposed the UN Charter amendment. Actually, nobody is opposed to UN Charter's amendment.
But reformation, the current to be reformed.
Yes, but everybody has different ideas. And like in 2005, when the G4 went with a proposal to the General Assembly for amending the Constitution or the Charter, then all kinds of other proposals came in. Even though the Secretary General himself had made a proposal to the World Summit for amendment, but eventually there were so many proposals on the table that nobody was sure which proposal would go through, and the G4, which had a proposal, did not eventually chickened and said that there was no point in pressing for a vote because they feared that they might lose the vote. So the matter was dropped over there. Now, when will India get a seat? I think certainly not in my lifetime. I don't know about God's lifetime. But
don't be such a pessimist.
well, the problem is that amending the charter has been amended only 5 times so far, and all on absolutely minor procedural issues. The only substantive change has been the membership of the Security Council from 10 to 15. Twice, Economic and Social Council from 18 to 27, then 27 to 54. 2 amendments. And 2 consequential amendments, because once the Security Council had been increased from 10 to 15, then the majority required for passing a resolution had to be changed. So that was changed from 7 to 9. So these are the only 5 amendments that have taken place. Now the world leaders who had met in 2005, they made a long series of recommendations. Among them were a series of amendments to the Charter. And the amendments are of such innocuous things like abolishing the Trusteeship Council, which has not met since 1994. Now, even that little thing has not been done because the Trusteeship Council has no work left. All the trustee territories have been given independence, and there is no work left. The council has not met, but the charter needs to be amended for that purpose, and no move has taken place so far to amend the charter. Then there were certain other recommendations. Yes, the reference to the enemy states. The UN, as you know, was formed essentially as a security organization against the 2 enemy states, Japan and Germany. And at 3 places in the charter, there is a reference to enemy states. Now, those enemy states have now joined the UN itself. So who are the enemy states? So the leaders recommended in 2005 that the word enemy states be dropped from the 3 articles. That has not taken place yet. So these are very innocuous amendments, and if it's put on the table, it will be passed. But everybody feels that the moment you open the Pandora's box, the whole edifice of like a pack of cards, it will come crumbling down. Which is why my apprehension that the amendment just may not take place, because it is so complex an issue. You mentioned about the question of the ROC and how the PRC took over. Now, if you look at the resolution of Albania in the General Assembly, the argument was that it is just a change in government of the same country. So there was no change in the country's representation, it's just that you're changing from instead of one government, you're into another government. The seat of the government may have changed, that's not an issue. In the case of the Russian Federation, was the argument of a successor state, which may or may not hold water. Yeah, the other points, thanks for those points about the Iran, Pakistan, Taiwan, etc. Thanks.
Your Excellency, you have to answer one of mine.
What is
Why India did not sign NPT? Pakistan says, if India sign it, I will sign it.
You see, the treaty is discriminatory. The treaty is discriminatory because it allows 5 states to keep nuclear weapons and others should not keep them. So why should we sign it? We are a nuclear power, and the NPT does not recognize us as a nuclear power. It's a long debate. I think we can keep it aside.
Sorry,
Please.
going across. No, Professor. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you whether, from your experience by being in the United Nations and outside of it as a diplomat, how would you assess the significance of China's UN membership, or UNSC membership to global politics? I mean, is China significantly more, And does it have more significance in global politics as a consequence of its membership in the UNSC? Would it have less? And I suppose the corollary question to that would be then, why is India constantly seeking membership in the UNSC, right? Is it because it feels it will have greater significance in global politics as a consequence of this? And another sort of linked concern with this is that really many of the more significant issues are settled outside the UNSC today, and in many other multilateral fora which are not part of the United Nations, whether it's development issues or otherwise. So how significant really is the UNSC in maintaining the kind of global politics that we are inured to today?
Last question. Oh, yeah. Have I missed anybody? Oh, General too. What? I mean, I just somehow stopped asking people to introduce themselves. His Excellency Ambassador Suresh Goyal, Professor Madhu Bhalla, yours.
Rajesh Ghosh. Since 2000, how has China...
You introducing yourself. Sorry.
Rajesh Ghosh.
Sorry, go on.
How has China reacted to issues of nuclear proliferation as far as Iran and North Korea is concerned? Because China also has interests, deep interests linked to Iran as far as energy is concerned, and North Korea for security reasons. And therefore it has to deal with both of them, not at the same time to engage with the international world to check proliferation, and at the same time to make sure that its interests are not harmed as far as Iran and North Korea is concerned. So how has it dealt with these two seemingly conflicting issues?
General? General Manager.
Yes. Just two good comments on first the UN peacekeeping operations participation, and also on the R2P a little bit, just for information. Of course, the factual information regarding peacekeeping, etc., that you mentioned is absolutely right. But just a little personal insight. One time, Norway, about 10 years ago, considered itself very rich and all that. I want to solve all the global problem. And Jens Stoltenberg, who was currently the Secretary General of the NATO, was then the Prime Minister of Norway. And he was visiting China. And one of his aims in visiting China, I think it was the year 2009, and was to get China to participate in global issues and things like that. Two principal questions: peace participation in peacekeeping operations, and addressing the climate change questions.
Which year was this?
I think it was 2009. I think 2009. He was visiting China. And because the peacekeeping operations came, I was invited by Jens Stoltenberg to go to China at that same time. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry organized a 2-day conference on UN peacekeeping operations. Only external participation were a few from Norway and a couple of others, I think, international. Yes. Very interesting participating in the debate that was internal taking place within the Chinese specialists. Of course, the peacekeeping operations from China, its participation is essentially by the People's Armed Police. That, of course, is undergoing major changes because of the structural changes in these things, because these were essentially non-combat roles. But China's decision to enter the peacekeeping operations thing as an image building and a commitment to participate in international affairs in a more substantial way was a reflection of its participation. The internal debates were considerable. Till today, they don't really substantially contribute to any peace, of course, no peace enforcement operations, and not even robust peacekeeping operations, and still linked to the areas of interest. But, and of course, in only recent years, just for the last 3 to 4 years, earlier the #1 participant was Pakistan, second Bangladesh, third India. Now it is Bangladesh first, India second, third, Pakistan in the other position. And since the Brahmi Commission report refining the UN peacekeeping operations and a larger participation by regional forces in regional peacekeeping operations, essentially relating to Africa, that African countries have come up in a larger way, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and others. Otherwise, they were very well behind. And so that is the new change that is taking place. And of course, the UN peacekeeping changes were really got the issues regarding the actual decision making in the peacekeeping, logistics support, where there's enormous amount of profit to be made. $7 to $8 billion a budget, there's a substantial amount of money that can be made out of that. It was all in the hands of the Western countries and the US in particular. The Brahmi Committee report, we changed that, and so the decision making in peacekeeping now, in all its policy and logistics as well, have been divided, and developing countries are participating very much more. And Bangladesh in particular is exploiting that to a substantial extent, and their officers are as a consequence doing very well. The Bangladesh maintains an army only for participation in even peacekeeping operations. It has got no other significant role at all, and not interested in anything else. The Army Committee report was very significant in this thing. Now on the question of the R2P, once again, you have to write this to the International Committee created by Canada. Gareth Evans and Amitav Sanu were the co-chairs of this. Co-chairs, and of course, India was consulted in that co-chairs committee, otherwise only the 5 permanent members of Security Councils are normally consulted and this thing. And they were consulted, and some of us gave our views on that. But very interestingly, just 3 years ago, and of course all the history of the R2P etc. is borne out, and it's now an official document because of the 2005 global report. But China has substantial reservations regarding R2P, but it cannot really express that. It didn't object to in 2005, there was a great debate whether India will actually go along with the R2P. And so there was a lot of debate, and of course the results of that. The CIIS in Beijing held a conference on the R2P. Small conference, but with Gareth Evans, Ramesh Thakur, also a member of that panel from Australia, participating in that. And the Chinese attempt there in the CIIS conference was to downplay and undermine the concept of R2P in a very non-official way. Because once again, intervention, etc., is not in line with the Chinese thinking, just as we feel strongly against that in principle. So that's how it emerged. But there, I must say, that they could not sustain their argument. And I think they've given up on that, the R2P, opposing the R2P.
Right, before we lose track of all the questions.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, General, for your views. I'll move on to the first question. Was significance of China in the UN Security Council? Well, China is a very significant member because it's a permanent member, and therefore to global politics, yes. The fact that you have the veto gives you tremendous power, because allies who are under the umbrella of this permanent member do not have to fear a resolution of the Security Council. That's a very important power that this country has, and that's the reason why India wants to join it. But of course, India will have to perhaps forego the veto, at least for a certain period of time, if it gets it. And there's already been a statement to that effect from the G4, that they will forego the veto till such time as a review conference takes place, or till such time as consensus is built on the issue. So membership, for permanent membership, will be useful, as anybody who knows the Security Council's functioning knows that most important issues are actually discussed at informal meetings among the P5 themselves. They meet separately, and they meet without the non-permanent members, and this practice started way back in 1986, when the Iran-Iraq war was going on, and the British ambassador decided to call the other 4. By that time, Gorbachev had come to power in the Soviet Union. There was a certain amount of glasnost taking place there, and they were willing to go to the British ambassador's house, and then started the practice of the 5 meetings separate, cooking up a resolution, then bringing it to the Security Council, where others are given the piece of paper and told, vote, don't vote. All the P5 require is 4 more votes thereafter, so they get 9 votes and they can pass the resolution. So permanent membership is important from this point of view, but of course the veto is equally important. Now, what has China achieved by this? Well, China has developed a small band of countries that are allied to it, which are willing to do its bidding. In international affairs, China has a status of some kind, not exactly the same as the Soviet Union, as Russia or the US. but it has a small band of countries that it can bank upon, and this is because of the veto protection that it can give to these countries. And it's for this reason that India wants the Security Council seat, so that it doesn't thereafter have to look to a permanent member to protect it in case something goes wrong, and let's say a war starts somewhere and a resolution is required, a resolution comes forward against India, then it will require support from other countries, and certainly from at least one P5 member. How have the Chinese reacted to nuclear proliferation? Well, China has been responsible for nuclear proliferation to very select countries, but it has been responsible. We have to accept that point. It may deny it, but the fact is that even Pakistan's test in 1998 was a plutonium test, and Pakistan did not have a plutonium program for making nuclear bombs. China's program was a uranium enrichment program of A.Q. Khan, but the bombs that were tested in May 1998 were plutonium-based bombs. Where Pakistan got it from? Anybody's guess. But clearly, the North Korean, again, there is enough evidence. There's a lot of exchange taking place between China and North Korea. Iran, again, of course, Iran probably got it more from Pakistan than from China, but then Pakistan again acts as a conduit for the centrifuges that were being inspected by the inspectors. So China has been careful to ensure that it goes to very select countries that it can trust. So to that extent, it is not responsible for widespread proliferation, but as far as we in India are concerned, it is serious enough. It may not affect countries in Africa or Latin America, but it certainly affects us. China's proliferation for us is a very serious matter.
Regarding the sanctions regarding proliferation and China's role in the UN Security Council, its interests with Iran and North Korea, right? And the international world wants to impose sanctions on these two countries for nuclear proliferation. So my question was, how has China reacted and tried to balance out sanctions by supporting the international community and as well as preserving its own interests? That was the question.
So most of the time, it takes place behind closed doors when the P5 meet. As you know, in the case of North Korea, the most recent resolution, there have been reports about how the US gave a first draft, which was a very strong draft, and then there were consultations. And in order to get the resolution adopted, the US had to dilute the resolution because China and Russia were bent upon vetoing it. So the US had to dilute the resolution to get it passed. In the case of Iran, there have been instances in the past where China has stepped in and stopped diluted resolutions, otherwise it threatened veto those resolutions. So many of these discussions take place behind closed doors where we don't have access to what exactly took place among those countries, but we know for sure that China does protect the interests of these countries. As in the case of Pakistan, we know of Masood Azhar case, where not only the Security Council but one of the committees, it protects Pakistan's interests. So this happens behind closed doors on the P5. Sure.
In the case of North Korea, as you would have noticed, with the resolution, the Security Council resolution, sanction resolution, which was adopted, China agreed to vote for it only after their concerns were met in the resolution by capping on the limit to which petroleum and petroleum product exports to North Korea would be controlled. Similarly, in the case of trade between from North Korea, again China was able to have its way through. They didn't allow the trade to stop with North Korea. Textiles, again the same thing. So they are able to use their veto power to protect their interests. If I could just
Yeah, absolutely. So China's interests are more limited, but they are there, and China protects those interests.
General had a question or comment? All right. Okay. So, right.
Listen, I think thanks for the points that you made.
Well, have we now? There we
All
are.
satisfied?
You have satisfied all the questions. Now I'm going to let you all into a secret, professional secret. I have actually half a dozen questions, but I have an unfair advantage. I can walk them into the mornings tonight as compared and raise my questions there. So, thank you very much, Ambassador Dilip Sinha, for this very educative afternoon. Thank all of you with raising very relevant questions, and I understand that there's a cup of tea and coffee available in the foyer. Thank you all very much.